Picture this. It's rush hour in Midtown Manhattan, December 16th, 1985.
Right in the middle of the holiday chaos.
Exactly. Christmas shoppers are literally everywhere. The streets have all those holiday lights glowing. And this black Lincoln Town car just pulls up right to Sparks' Steakhouse.
Right.
And before the passenger can even get his foot fully onto the curb, 4 men wearing these matching trench coats and Russian fur hats, they just step right out of the crowd.
Like out of nowhere.
Literally out of nowhere. They pull semi-automatic weapons and they execute the man and his bodyguard on the pavement, right in front of hundreds of witnesses.
It's just brazen.
Yeah, and then they simply melt back into the Manhattan evening. Like that wasn't a movie scene, that was a hostile corporate takeover in the American mafia.
It really was. It was a public execution that fundamentally changed the landscape of organized crime in the U.S.
Totally.
And the man bleeding out on the pavement was Paul Castellano, the boss of the Gambino crime family.
So welcome to our deep dive. Today, we're going on a mission to completely deconstruct the rise, the absolute peak, and, well, the catastrophic self-destruction of what was once America's most powerful criminal syndicate.
A multi-billion-dollar syndicate.
Right. And we have this massive stack of documentary sources, FBI files, historical transcripts right in front of us. And the goal today is to pull back the curtain for you.
Because if you think you understand the mob from the movies, prepare to have that illusion shattered.
Oh, completely shattered. The actual mechanics of how this empire was built, how it operated, and how it violently imploded is so much stranger and, frankly, a lot more educational than Hollywood ever portrayed.
I agree, because at its core, this isn't just a story about crime. I mean, yes, the violence is a central tool, obviously.
Obvious.
But if we look at the underlying structures, this is really a profound case study in organizational dynamics.
Yeah, it's about the life cycle of an empire, really.
Exactly. We're looking at the danger of unchecked ego, the strict adherence to old world rules, and that fatal tension that happens when those traditional rules just, collide with modern greed.
And the rise of the surveillance state.
Right, that too.
We're talking about an arc that spans decades. You have a founder, this immigrant, who arrives with nothing and builds a multi-million-dollar conglomerate by, intentionally acting like a harmless, doddering grandfather.
Just Geppetto routine.
Right. Then his successor, the guy who died on the pavement, tries to run the mob like a Fortune 500 company while hiding in this isolated mansion on Staten Island.
Which didn't work out so well for him.
No, it didn't. And finally, you get this media-obsessed brawler who brings the entire structure crashing down, basically because he started believing his own press clippings.
It's a classic tragic arc.
It really is. So to actually understand how a multi-billion-dollar shadow economy collapses, we have to start at the foundation. We have to go back to the blueprint. Let's talk about the architect himself, Carlo Gambino.
So to understand Carlo, you have to deeply understand the environment that forged his psychology.
Right.
We have to go back to the early 1900s, specifically to Palermo, Sicily. Carlo was born there in 1902.
Okay, so turn of the century, was he super poor?
Actually, no. He wasn't born into poverty at all. His family was relatively prosperous and well-connected.
Whoa, interesting.
Yeah, but the defining feature of his childhood wasn't his family's status. It was the fact that his entire neighborhood, the very air he breathed, was completely dominated by the mafia.
The honored society, right.
Exactly.
I always hear that term in the sources, but what did that actually look like on a day-to-day basis for a kid growing up there?
Well, it looked like an alternate government. The honored society was so deeply entrenched in the culture and the economy of Palermo that large parts of the city were virtually off limits to the actual Italian police.
Or the military, right.
Right. They were a law unto themselves. They settled disputes. They controlled the markets. They even dictated who got jobs. If you had a problem, you didn't go to the police because the police were either completely powerless or just totally corrupt. You went to the local don.
And for a young kid, that has to be just intoxicating. You read the descriptions in these transcripts of these mafia elders strolling down the cobblestone streets, and it's pure theater.
Oh, absolutely.
They wore these beautiful tailored suits. The respect they commanded was absolute. I mean, men would literally stop what they were doing and take off their hats as these dons walked by.
Women would curtsy and kiss their hands.
Right. They were treated like royalty. So if you're a sharp, observant kid seeing that, you don't want to be the mayor or the police chief. You want to be that guy.
You want to be a man of respect. And the man who made the biggest impression on young Carlo was Don Vito Casciofero.
Okay, who was he?
Don Vito was the head of the honored society at the time. And he's a crucial figure because he was sort of a pioneer in criminal economics.
Criminal economics. I like that phrase.
Well, before Don Vito, the mafia largely relied on blunt force pillaging. If a business owner didn't cooperate, the mob just destroyed their shop or killed them.
Which is bad for business.
Terribly bad. Don Vito realized that approach was awful for long-term profit. You can't shear a dead sheep, as they say.
Right. He practically invented the mob subscription service.
Exactly. He perfected the art of charging moderate, predictable fees for protection. It was a highly sustainable extortion model.
So smart.
He would calculate exactly how much a business could afford to pay without going under. So the businesses could operate smoothly, the mafia got a steady cut, and violence was really only used as a last resort to enforce the contract.
It's brilliant in a highly sociopathic way. He's optimizing the local economy for his own tax collection.
That's exactly what it was.
So Carlo idolizes this guy, right? He drops out of school as a teenager, and he actually becomes an enforcer for Don Vito. If you don't pay your subscription fee, young Carlo is the one who arranges an accident for you.
Yep, he was the muscle early on.
But here's where it gets really interesting to me, and I kind of struggle to reconcile this. Carlo didn't look like a monster.
Not at all.
He was like 5'7", maybe 150 pounds. He didn't wear the flashy suits yet. He had this prominent hawk-like nose and this constant mischievous grin. He looked entirely unassuming.
Totally normal guy.
Right. So how does a 5'7" guy with an unassuming grin survive a room full of hardened killers without being viewed as, weak meat?
Because in that specific culture, violence is expected, but cunning is feared.
Oh, I like that.
His unassuming nature became his greatest camouflage. He wasn't the biggest guy in the room, so he never posed an immediate physical threat to the massive egos around him.
He flew under the radar.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But by the time he was 19, his shrewdness, his ability to calculate risk, and just his absolute ruthlessness earned him formal induction into the honored society as a made man.
Wow, at 19.
Yeah, he was recognized very early as someone who could think 3 steps ahead.
But just as he's getting his start, the geopolitical ground shifts completely. We're in the early 1920s now, and Benito Mussolini and the fascist regime are taking absolute power in Italy.
And Mussolini had a massive ego of his own.
Yeah, he had zero tolerance for the mafia, basically because they were a competing power structure. You can't have a totalitarian state if people are bowing to a local don instead of the dictator.
Right. So Mussolini initiated this brutal, uncompromising crackdown. He sent an enforcer named Cesare Mori to Sicily. They called him the Iron Prefect.
Sounds terrifying.
He was. Mori's tactics were completely draconian. He would lay siege to entire towns, cut off the water supply, and literally take women and children hostage until the suspected mafiosi surrendered.
So staying in Sicily meant almost certain death or life in a fascist dungeon.
Pretty much.
So Carlo evaluates the board, realizes the game in Italy is lost, and looks to his network. His mother's family, the Castellanos, had already emigrated and set up shop in New York.
A very smart pivot.
Very. So in November of 1921, this 19-year-old kid gets smuggled aboard a freighter. And I just love the tactile detail of this. In the sources, he's crossing the Atlantic, secretly tucked away in the hold of a ship packed with a cargo of wine, anchovies, and olives.
The smells must have been intense.
Right. He arrives in Norfolk, Virginia, steps off the boat in his Sunday best, and he just struts off like he owns the world.
And he didn't have to struggle like most immigrants. He was met by his Castellano cousins and whisked right up to New York.
He wasn't a humble immigrant arriving at Ellis Island with a bindle.
No, not at all. He was a fully initiated made man, treated like visiting royalty from the old country.
That's wild.
And the timing of his arrival is arguably the luckiest break of his entire life. Mm-hmm. He arrives in late 1921, right at the dawn of Prohibition.
It is the ultimate startup environment for organized crime. The U.S. government just made the most popular beverage in the country illegal.
A massive unforced error.
Right. The public desperately wants booze, they are willing to pay a premium for it, and the mob is perfectly positioned to supply it.
Now, the Castellano family had a small, legitimate trucking business. Overnight, that infrastructure was converted into a highly lucrative bootlegging operation.
Of course it was.
Trucks that used to carry legal goods were now moving illicit liquor down from Canada or out from hidden distilleries.
And what's Carlo doing?
He starts out at the bottom of this new hierarchy as a driver and a shotgun rider, literally sitting shotgun to protect shipments from being hijacked by rival gangs.
But he's a strategic thinker. He quickly realizes that while the Castellanos are family, they are small fish in a very big Very violent pond.
To survive and thrive in New York, he needs to align himself with the major players.
Which leads him to a man named Joe the Boss Masseria.
Right. Masseria was an old-time Sicilian leader. They called that older generation Mustache Pete's. And he was running a massive citywide bootlegging racket.
So Carlo goes to work for him.
He does. And quickly proves himself not just as a capable enforcer, but as this really acute businessman and organizer.
But this raises a fascinating point about Carlo's core character. We just established he was deeply immersed in this traditional Sicilian culture of honor and loyalty, right?
Yes, very traditional.
Yet fundamentally, Carlo was entirely transactional. He realized very quickly that the old world concept of blind loyalty to a single don was a massive liability in America.
It was a death sentence.
Exactly. In Sicily, the power structures were ancient and static. In 1920s New York, it was the Wild West. Clinging to one boss out of misplaced loyalty could get you killed the moment a rival gang decided to stage a takeover.
He was a pragmatist above all else. The American underworld was highly volatile, and Carlo recognized that survival required absolute flexibility.
And this brings us to a massive, bloody conflict in the early 1930s known as the Castellammarese War.
Right. It was an all-out turf war between Joe Masseria and a powerful rival boss named Salvatore Maranzano.
The streets of New York were literally turning into war zones.
Bodies dropping everywhere.
I look at Carlo in this era, and he reminds me of a totally ruthless venture capitalist in an emerging market. He didn't invent the bootlegging rackets, he didn't start the war, but he optimized his position within the chaos with zero emotional attachment.
And this is exactly where Carlo's defining philosophy comes into play. He famously operated by the principle that a successful man must be like a lion and a fox.
The lion and the fox.
Yes. The fox is smart enough to recognize the traps, and the lion is strong enough to scare away the wolves. Carlo was playing the fox perfectly during this war.
But how does that actually play out mechanically? How do you avoid the constant assassinations that are wiping out dozens of other mid-level mobsters who pick the wrong side?
You survive by having superior intelligence gathering,
Right.
anticipating which side is going to win, and preemptively betraying your current boss before his ship sinks.
Wow. Cold.
Very cold. Carlo had become close friends with another rising star, Lucky Luciano.
Ah, lucky Luciano.
Right. Luciano was a visionary who hated the old world feuds. He came to Carlo and a few others with a plan to eliminate their own boss, Joe Masseria.
Just cut the head off the snake.
Luciano basically said, the old men are destroying the business with this war. We eliminate Masseria, we align with Maranzano, and we become the winning side.
And Carlo, the loyal Sicilian, doesn't blink. He just quietly supports the plot.
Didn't hesitate.
So in April 1931, Luciano invites his boss, Masseria, to a seafood lunch at a restaurant in Coney Island. They have a big meal, they play some cards.
Classic mob setup.
Classic. Luciano conveniently excuses himself to go to the bathroom. The second he's gone, 4 gunmen walk into the restaurant and shoot Joe the boss dead right there at the card table.
And Carlo immediately pivots and pledges allegiance to the victor, Salvatore Maranzano.
The new boss.
Right. Maranzano declares himself the boss of bosses and thinks he has finally won the war. He thinks he's got these bright, capable young guys like Luciano and Gambino working loyally beneath him.
But the ink isn't even dry on the peace treaty and they do it again.
Exactly. Maranzano didn't realize that the young generation viewed him as just another outdated obstacle. They were already plotting his murder.
That's insane.
Just 5 months after Masseria was killed, hitmen disguised as IRS agents walk into Maranzano's Park Avenue office and stab and shoot him to death.
It's breathtaking treachery. So within 6 months, Carlo has quietly helped orchestrate the assassination of the 2 most powerful mob bosses in America simply by playing the fox and staying out of the direct line of fire.
With the old guard gone, Lucky Luciano takes over and fundamentally restructures the American underworld.
He builds the commission, right?
Yes. He realizes that constant warfare is terrible for the bottom line. It brings police attention and disrupts business. So he creates a corporate board of directors known as the Commission.
Like a syndicate of syndicates.
It was designed to govern the various crime families across the country, settle disputes peacefully through voting, and regulate the illegal economy.
It's a massive structural innovation. Instead of a monarchy, it's an oligarchy. And in this new, more corporate structure, Carlo absolutely thrives.
He does. He's assigned to operate on the Brooklyn waterfront under a new boss named Vincent Mangano.
And Carlo doesn't care about the limelight.
Not at all. He cares about the ledger. He aggressively expands into loan sharking, the illegal numbers game, and widespread cargo theft. He is purely profit-driven.
And his success is undeniable. I mean, by the time he is 29 years old, he is promoted to capo captain, running his own highly lucrative crew.
But being a capo means you need a crew of soldiers you can trust implicitly. And as Carlo himself had just proven twice over, trust in this world is a total illusion.
Because you are constantly watching your back, worried that the young guys under you are plotting your demise, just like he did.
Exactly. So Carlo makes a move that to an outsider seems bizarre, but strategically it is brilliant.
He decides the only people he can even remotely trust are blood relatives.
He sets out to build an impenetrable wall of family around himself. And he takes this to an extreme level. In 1932, he actually marries his own first cousin, Catherine Castellano.
I still can't get over that detail. It was a highly unorthodox move, right? As strict Catholics, they had to get a special dispensation from the church just to allow the marriage.
They did. But from a purely Machiavellian standpoint, it made perfect sense. The Castellanos were an incredibly powerful faction within the underworld.
So by marrying Catherine, Carlo wasn't just taking a wife. He was executing a massive corporate merger.
That's the best way to describe it. He multiplied his political power within the mafia and ensured that his absolute inner circle was bound to him by literal blood.
He eliminated the variable of outside betrayal.
Yes, and that structure pays off handsomely. Over the next 2 decades, he just quietly makes fortunes while other mobsters are getting their names in the paper and going to prison.
Right, like during Prohibition, he gets busted for running a massive 1-million-gallon illegal still in Philadelphia, but he beats the tax evasion rap in 1937. He just pays for the best lawyers and slips away.
Then World War II hits, and while the country is rationing, Carlo sees an entirely new market to exploit.
He realizes that the government's rationing system for essential goods, meat, gasoline, sugar, nylons, it relies on physical ration stamps.
The ultimate fiat currency at the time.
Precisely. And Carlo starts making a killing, stealing and hoarding these stamps, then selling them on the black market at an enormous markup.
But he didn't just rob people for them on the street. He systematized the theft.
How so?
He would bribe officials from the Office of Price Administration to steal the stamps directly from the government vaults before they were even distributed.
Industrial scale theft. What fascinates me here is his total willingness to exploit any vulnerability for profit, regardless of traditional mob taboos.
He's very creative.
Right. You usually think of the mafia operating in construction or gambling, but Carlo recognized early on the power of white-collar crime and leveraging societal secrets.
For example, his move into blackmail.
Yeah, the blackmailing of closeted gay men. Let's talk about that.
It was a cold, calculated analysis of leverage. In the 1950s and 60s, being outed as a homosexual could entirely destroy a doctor's, a lawyer's, or an executive's life.
They would lose their careers, their families, everything.
Everything. Carlo realized these professionals had high disposable incomes and a desperate, agonizing need for secrecy. So the mob took over the gay bar scene in New York.
But they didn't run the bars to support the lifestyle?
No. They ran them as hunting grounds to harvest targets for extortion.
It's incredibly predatory. They would find out who these wealthy men were and then just quietly bleed them dry under the threat of exposure.
And the victims couldn't go to the police because going to the police would out them anyway.
It was a perfect closed-loop extortion racket.
So Carlo is making millions. He is highly respected. But by the early 1950s, he is still technically just an underboss.
To Vincent Mangano.
Right. But Mangano mysteriously disappears in 1951. It was an open secret that Mangano was murdered by his own underboss, a terrifying man named Albert Anastasia.
Anastasia, who was notoriously the head of the mob's enforcement arm, Murder Incorporated. So Anastasia takes over the family, and now Carlo is in a very precarious position.
He's in his mid-50s. Anastasia is roughly the same age. If Carlo just waits for a natural succession, he might die of old age before he ever becomes boss.
Plus, Anastasia is highly volatile.
Extremely volatile.
Yeah.
Violently unpredictable, and he's bringing too much heat onto the family's rackets.
So Carlo, the fox, decides it's time to be the lion. He recognizes that Anastasia is a liability to the bottom line and an obstacle to his own ambition.
So, in secret alliance with bosses from other families who also want Anastasia gone, Carlo sets up a hit.
It's October 25, 1957. Albert Anastasia goes in for a shave and a haircut at the barbershop in the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan.
He's relaxing in the barber chair, eyes closed, hot towel on his face.
Two gunmen with their faces covered by scarves rush in, push the barber out of the way, and shoot Anastasia 5 times. He actually dies lunging at their reflections in the mirror.
It was a brutal end.
And just like that, the violent obstacle is removed, and Carlo Gambino is officially the boss of his own crime family.
Which brings us to the zenith of his power. Carlo has finally reached the top. He has connived, negotiated, and killed his way to the absolute pinnacle of the American underworld.
But what makes Carlo truly exceptional is that once he achieves supreme power, his strategy completely changes. Most men at that level become drunk on their own authority.
Carlo recognized that his new position made him the biggest target in the country. To stay alive, he relies on a strategy of extreme, deliberate invisibility.
It is the ultimate paradox of his reign. Under Carlo's leadership, the Gambino family swells to an estimated 800 made men and thousands of associates spread across 25 distinct crews.
They are generating roughly $500 million a year.
Let's break down the sheer scale of this conglomerate, because it wasn't just street crime. He was a visionary when it came to economic choke points.
He fundamentally understood supply chains. For example, he deeply infiltrated the garment industry in New York.
Okay, so at that time, the New York garment district produced about 70% of all the clothes sold in the entire United States.
That's right. And Carlo didn't bother trying to own the factories. He took over the trucking unions that moved the clothes.
Wait, so if I own a clothing factory in Manhattan in 1965, how exactly does the mob squeeze me? What's the literal mechanism?
Well, let's say you've just manufactured 10,000 dresses for the spring season. They need to get to department stores across the country immediately.
Right.
But Carlo Gambino controls the union leadership of the truckers. If you don't pay a hidden mob tax on every single garment you produce, the union simply refuses to pick up your freight.
So your inventory rots in the warehouse.
Exactly. You miss a season, and your business goes bankrupt. You have absolutely no choice but to pay the extortion.
It's literally a toll booth on American capitalism, and he did the exact same thing at the airports, didn't he?
He did. He arranged a strategic marriage between his son Tommy and the daughter of another major crime boss, Thomas Luchese.
This wasn't just young love, was it?
No, this was a corporate merger that gave the Gambino and Luchese families absolute unified control over the cargo handlers at John F. Kennedy International Airport.
JFK. Billions of dollars in freight moves through there. By controlling the unions there, the Gambinos could orchestrate massive, systematic cargo thefts. Electronics, jewelry, cash entire shipments would just vanish off the tarmac.
They also moved heavily into construction bid rigging.
Let's unpack that, because bid rigging sounds like a boring white-collar crime, but it's incredibly lucrative. How did they actually rig the construction of skyscrapers in New York?
When a city or a developer wants to build a massive project, they put it out to bid. Contractors submit secret proposals, and the lowest bidder usually wins.
Standard practice.
Right. The Gambinos formed a cartel of corrupt contractors. The mob would secretly dictate which contractor was scheduled to win a specific job.
Oh, I see.
That contractor would submit an artificially high bid, and all the other contractors in the cartel would submit even higher, dummy bids to make the winner look legitimate.
So the city ends up overpaying by millions of dollars for a new hospital or a bridge.
Exactly. And the winning contractor then pays a percentage of that inflated profit directly back to the Gambino family as a kickback. It was a massive invisible tax on the entire infrastructure of New York City.
He is running a shadow economy that rivals a Fortune 500 company. But you look at his actual lifestyle, and it makes absolutely no sense. If you or I were making a fraction of that money, we'd be on a yacht in Monaco.
He was arguably the most powerful man in New York, with more actual raw street power than the mayor or the governor, but he lived in a modest middle-class row house in Brooklyn.
It's crazy.
He intentionally cultivated this persona that the press came to call the Geppetto look.
Yeah.
If you saw him walking down the street, you would think he was just a humble, harmless little old Italian grandfather.
He wore plain overcoats and simple hats. He moved slowly.
His invisibility was his armor. By looking weak, frail, and entirely harmless, he disarmed law enforcement and lulled his rivals into a false sense of superiority.
The psychological warfare of that is just incredible. The FBI knew exactly who he was, of course. They eventually parked a marked Organized Crime Control Bureau police car right outside his Brooklyn house.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
They were desperate to catch him ordering a crime, but they couldn't do it.
And the reason they couldn't catch him is a masterclass in operational security. The documentary transcripts detail his anti-wiretap strategy. Carlo operated in absolute terrifying silence.
Terrifying silence. I love that.
He strictly adhered to omerta, the mafia code of silence, to an extent that bordered on paranoia. He assumed every room, every phone, every vehicle was bugged.
There is this anecdote that perfectly illustrates this, the Froggy Legs story.
Yeah.
How did a man control an empire of 800 violent men without speaking?
By establishing an understood code that required no verbal confirmation from the boss. If a capo came into Carlo's home to suggest that a rival needed to be assassinated, the capo wouldn't lay out a detailed plan. He might just stand up, look at Carlo, and say a seemingly nonsensical code phrase like froggy legs. Carlo wouldn't utter a single syllable.
Not a word.
He would simply look at the man and give a subtle nod, or maybe a tiny flick of his wrist.
A man's life ended with a nod. And the beauty of it is, how does a federal prosecutor put a nod on trial?
You can't. Even if the FBI had a microphone planted perfectly in the center of the table, all the tape would capture is silence, followed by the squeak of a chair as the capo left the room. It was legally bulletproof.
But as much as he tried to hide, the sheer gravity of his power pulled people into his orbit. The level of respect he commanded was staggering.
There's a documented instance where Carlo went to see Frank Sinatra perform at the Westchester Premier Theater.
Sinatra was arguably the biggest star in the world at the time.
He was. And when Sinatra found out Carlo Gambino was in the building, he actually delayed the start of his own second show by 40 minutes.
He kept thousands of paying fans waiting in their seats just so he could host Carlo in his dressing room, pay his respects, and ensure the old man wasn't rushed.
The biggest star in the world, putting his audience on hold for this little old man in a gray suit.
Because the power was intensely real and everyone in the know understood it. But Carlo was incredibly disciplined about not flaunting it.
Although there was one tiny slip of vanity that humanizes him just a bit.
Oh, the license plate. Yeah, he absolutely refused to buy a flashy Cadillac or a Lincoln. He drove a dark, completely unassuming Oldsmobile.
But he just couldn't resist getting a vanity license plate with his initials. CG1.
It was his one tiny concession to his own ego, a little subtle signal to the streets that he, in fact, had the juice.
But aside from that vanity plate, his entire life was structured as a defense mechanism against the government. And we cannot overlook the vital role his wife, Catherine, played in this ecosystem.
No, we can't. She wasn't just a passive bystander baking ziti. She was an essential, active component of his security apparatus.
She was the ultimate soft power weapon.
The transcript paints this amazing picture of the dynamics in the Gambino house. Tough, heavily armed, highly aggressive, wise guys would come to the house, maybe looking to complain about a dispute or aggressively negotiate a bigger cut of a racket with Carlo.
Right, coming in hot.
But before they could even get into the room with the boss, Catherine would intercept them in the kitchen.
She played the traditional maternal Italian homemaker to absolute perfection. She'd sit them down, offer them a special cup of espresso, bring out pastries, and start asking them very politely and genuinely about their wives, their kids, their mother's health.
By the time these hardened, adrenaline-fueled killers actually walked into the living room to sit down with the boss, they had been completely emotionally disarmed.
One associate literally testified that Catherine turned these monsters into marshmallows.
Marshmallows. Carlo didn't even have to raise his voice because his wife had already de-escalated the situation. It was a brilliant, unified front.
But maintaining that front required constant vigilance. And by the late 1960s and early 1970s, the law was steadily closing in.
The FBI was relentless. Carlo was eventually indicted for masterminding a string of armored car robberies.
Furthermore, the government found a vulnerability in his immigration status and pushed incredibly hard to deport him back to Sicily as an illegal alien.
But Carlo's network of corruption was too vast. He couldn't kill his way out of a deportation order, so he bought his way out.
He essentially bribed two powerful U.S. congressmen, putting them on a permanent retainer of $1,000 a month for life.
Just to introduce private bills in Congress to stall his deportation hearings indefinitely. And whenever the legal pressure or the threat of a trial got too high, his long-standing heart condition would conveniently flare up.
He was known to drink up to 12 cups of black espresso a day, which certainly didn't help his cardiovascular system, but he absolutely weaponized his own frailty.
He would be admitted to the hospital. His high-priced doctors would testify that the stress of a trial would literally kill him, and the government would just have to back off.
He beat the system. On October 15, 1976, Carlo Gambino died of a natural heart attack while sitting in a chair watching a New York Yankees game at his summer home in Long Island.
He was 74 years old. He had run the most violent, powerful crime family in America for 20 years, ordered countless murders, orchestrated billions in theft, and he never spent a single day in prison as the boss.
Which is an astonishing historical anomaly for a mafia don.
Truly. His funeral was a massive spectacle, drawing thousands of mourners, police, and FBI agents. But here's the critical pivot in our story. For all of Carlo's brilliance, for all his reliance on the lion and fox philosophy, he made one catastrophic miscalculation at the very end of his life.
And he was born out of that exact same obsession with bloodlines that had kept him safe for so long.
Right. He had to pick a successor to run the empire. His own sons were involved in the business, but they were largely white-collar guys.
They didn't have the deep street credibility or the sheer menace required to control a family of 800 killers.
So Carlo looks to his family tree, and he taps his first cousin and brother-in-law, Paul Castellano. Big Paul.
And this decision, as the experts note, was like King Lear blindly dividing his kingdom. It set the stage for total, irreversible annihilation.
Let's examine Paul Castellano, because his ascension represents a fundamental, fatal cultural shift within the organization.
Paul was 13 years younger than Carlo. He had dropped out of school in the 8th grade and trained as a meat cutter in a butcher shop.
He got his start in the illegal numbers racket and did a brief stint in jail in 1934 for a botched armed robbery,
where he actually earned a little respect for keeping his mouth shut and not ratting out his accomplices.
But fundamentally, Paul was not a creature of the streets in the way the traditional mobsters were. He was driven primarily by a desire for legitimate wealth, not by a desire for underworld respect.
He viewed the mafia not as a sacred brotherhood bound by honor, but simply as a corporate entity that he happened to be the CEO of.
Right, he had legitimate wholesale meat businesses serving as his front, most notably Dial Poultry.
But the physical and psychological contrast with Carlo is what's so striking.
Carlo lived in a modest row house and wore an old coat to blend in. When Big Paul takes over, the first thing he does is build himself a $3.5 million mega mansion on Staten Island.
He actually called it his White House, intentionally designing it with massive columns to mimic the president's residence.
Which tells you absolutely everything you need to know about the scale of his ego.
He isolated himself on the top of Todd Hill, completely physically and psychologically removed from the daily life of the average mobster and his family.
He stopped going to the dingy social clubs in Brooklyn and Queens. He stopped interacting with the blue-collar soldiers who were actually out on the street taking the massive legal and physical risks to generate the money.
I see Big Paul like an out-of-touch corporate executive.
Exactly. Imagine a CEO who slashes employee benefits, refuses to ever step foot on the hot, dangerous factory floor, only talks to his board members, and then builds himself a massive, ostentatious corner office with a private elevator.
Eventually, the factory workers are going to strike because they feel exploited. But in the mob, a labor strike is a lot more fatal.
Paul openly looked down on the street-level guys. The source documents show he actually called them meat and potatoes thieves. Guys like John Gotti, who were out there hijacking trucks, enforcing loans, and doing the dirty, violent work.
Paul preferred to wear immaculate tailored suits, read the Wall Street Journal, and dine with Fortune 500 executives at high-end places like Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan.
He would dictate exactly how his steaks should be cut, leveraging his old butcher background, reveling in having 8 waiters doting on him.
He desperately wanted to be seen as a legitimate, sophisticated titan of industry. But by projecting that air of a soft negotiator rather than a feared, omnipresent boss, he broke the cardinal rule of La Cosa Nostra leadership.
He lost the respect, and more importantly, he lost the fear of his own troops. And his greed was just staggering. It actively alienated his workforce.
The standard mob tax, the cut that a crew is required to kick up to the boss from their illicit earnings, was traditionally 10%.
But Paul unilaterally decides that this is enough to fund his lifestyle, and he demands 15%.
It's the perfect corporate analogy. It's like owning a McDonald's franchise. And the corporate headquarters suddenly decides to raise your franchise fee by 50% while simultaneously refusing to pay for local advertising or store security.
Exactly. If a crew pulled off a massive, highly dangerous $500,000 score, they had to send Paul $75,000. And Paul would routinely throw a tantrum over that envelope, demanding to know why he wasn't getting more since he was the boss.
He would openly complain to his capos about the thickness of his Christmas envelopes.
This is a textbook example of a leader completely failing to understand the social contract of his own organization.
The street guys felt they were literally bleeding for this money, risking 20-year prison sentences, and this pampered businessman who hadn't paid his dues on the street in 40 years was just taxing them to death from a mansion on a hill.
But the profound hypocrisy of Big Paul is what really gets me. He wants to be seen as this clean corporate guy, right? He hates the messy street thugs. But when you look at the FBI files from this era, you see the absolute monsters he employed to maintain his grip on power.
Take the Westies, for example.
The Westies were this notoriously psychopathic Irish gang operating out of Hell's Kitchen. They were wild, unpredictable, and they started roughing up and even killing Gambino associates over loan sharking disputes.
Now, a traditional boss like Carlo or Anastasia would have simply wiped the Westies out with a massive show of force.
But Paul viewed violence through a purely corporate lens. Instead of going to war, Paul calls a meeting at a restaurant. He sits down with the leaders of the Westies, Jimmy Coonan and Mickey Featherstone, and he literally franchises the Gambino name to them.
He treats them like a subsidiary.
He basically says, I don't want a war. You can use my name to terrorize the West Side. Having the Gambino backing will make you untouchable by other gangs. In exchange, you give me 10% of all your earnings, and you must ask my permission before you murder anyone.
It was a purely transactional approach to terror.
Yeah.
And he did the exact same thing internally with a man named Roy DeMeo.
DeMeo ran a crew within the Gambino family that functioned as a specialized murder-for-hire division.
Yeah.
And their methodology was horrific, even by mafia standards.
It's sickening.
Yeah.
We have to touch on how they operated just to show the contrast between Paul's clean image and his dirty reality.
Yeah, let's explain it.
DeMeo's crew operated out of a lounge in Brooklyn. They perfected what they called the Gemini method. They would lure a target into the apartment behind the bar.
Okay.
One man would shoot the victim in the head with a silenced pistol wrapped in a towel. Another would instantly stab them in the heart to stop blood flow. They would drag the body to a bathtub, bleed it out entirely, dismember the remains, package the parts in boxes, and dump them in the Fountain Avenue landfill.
It was an industrial slaughterhouse for human beings. The FBI estimates they committed over 250 murders.
And Paul Castellano happily collected his percentage of DeMeo's stolen car and drug profits. And he absolutely used that slaughterhouse crew to carry out personal hits to protect his own family.
When Paul's own son-in-law was rumored to be beating Paul's daughter and causing a miscarriage, Paul had DeMeo's crew vanish the guy.
So behind this carefully curated facade of the well-dressed businessman reading the Wall Street Journal was a man totally willing to utilize the most extreme, gruesome violence imaginable.
As long as he didn't have to get his own hands dirty or see the blood.
Exactly. But despite all that insulated power, Paul's personal life behind the walls of the White House was a sad, bizarre mess.
The isolation really began to rot him from the inside out. He suffered from severe diabetes, which reportedly caused impotence. He and his wife, Nina, slept in separate rooms, sometimes going weeks without speaking a word to each other.
He was entirely alienated from his own family. So he turns to his young Colombian maid, a woman named Gloria Olarte, for comfort.
He gets a surgical penile implant specifically so he can consummate the affair with his maid. His wife eventually finds out and leaves him.
And in the tight-knit, highly judgmental world of the mafia, this became an open, humiliating joke among his capos.
It completely eroded his mystique. The
Yeah.
boss of the most feared crime family in America was acting, as the street guy saw it, like a love-struck fool over his domestic help.
He would complain endlessly to Gloria that he was lonely, that he only had millions of dollars in his pocket, but no actual love in his life.
He even bought her toy clowns and made her play with them in the kitchen just to make him smile.
Toy clowns. Could you imagine a hardened street enforcer like John Gotti hearing through the grapevine that the boss, the guy taxing them 15% and threatening to kill them if they step out of line, is sitting in his mansion playing with toy clowns?
It's just blood in the water. The respect was totally gone. But it was this exact reliance on Gloria, his desperate need for companionship, that gave the FBI the literal, physical key to his kingdom.
Exactly. The FBI was absolutely desperate to bug Paul's mansion. They knew he was running the commission from Tot Hill.
But the White House was a fortress. It had iron fences, a state-of-the-art electronic security system, and a roaming, highly aggressive Rottweiler.
And even if they could sneak a bug inside, the house was massive. They needed to know exactly which room Paul used to hold his criminal meetings.
If they risk everything to plant a bug in the living room, but he talks business in the basement, the entire operation is a failure.
So the FBI agents just casually start bumping into Gloria while she's out running errands at the grocery store. They offer to buy her a cup of coffee.
Paul had actually warned her not to lie to the feds if they ever approached her, figuring that tripping up on a lie and getting caught in a perjury trap was worse than just saying nothing.
But Gloria, lacking any understanding of operational security, unwittingly gives away the golden ticket.
In casual conversation, she mentions that Mr. Paul likes to sit at the kitchen table to make his phone calls and hold his meetings with the men who visit.
That is actionable, precise intelligence. In March 1983, the FBI orchestrates a daring, incredibly tense operation.
They wait until they know Paul's regular television repairman is scheduled to visit. They intercept the real repairman, and they send an undercover FBI agent to the mansion posing as him.
Okay, but planting a bug in a mob boss's house isn't like hiding a nanny cam on a bookshelf. How does an FBI agent pull this off with people in the house?
It was incredibly risky. Paul, Gloria, and Paul's heavily armed, intensely paranoid bodyguard, Tommy Bellotti, are all in the house.
In fact, Bellotti is hovering right over the undercover agent, watching his every move, standing guard while the agent pretends to fix the television in the kitchen.
The tension of that moment is wild. The agent is tweaking wires on the back of a TV set, and right under the nose of a mob killer who would gladly shoot him in the head if he realized what was happening, the agent slips a tiny microphone into the baseboard of the kitchen.
He wires it into the house's electrical system so it never needs a battery change, and it works flawlessly.
Over the next 4.5 months, the FBI records over 600 hours of crystal clear conversations.
Now, to be fair, a lot of those 600 hours were excruciatingly mundane. It was Paul talking about recipes, or the sounds of Paul eating massive, heavy Italian meals with his cronies for 4 hours at a time.
But woven in between the courses were clear, unambiguous conversations about slicing up mafia business across the 5 boroughs, discussing bid-rigging margins, and actively ordering hits.
Because he felt completely safe in his fortress, Paul abandoned Carlo Gambino's silent froggy legs protocol. He was systematically, verbally providing the exact evidence required for his own downfall.
But the feds weren't the only ones closing in on the boss. A massive internal crisis was brewing simultaneously, and it centered directly on John Gotti's ambitious, blue-collar crew operating out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Queens.
In August 1983, several of Gotti's key guys, including his own brother Gene and his loudmouth best friend Angelo Ruggiero, get arrested by the federal government for smuggling massive quantities of heroin.
This was a critical, potentially fatal infraction within the Gambino family. Paul Castellano had laid down a strict, absolute edict. No dealing drugs.
The rationale wasn't moral. It was purely a matter of risk management and game theory.
I need to understand this drug ban. Why heroin? They murder people, they extort businesses, they steal millions. Why is heroin the line in the sand that you cannot cross?
It comes down to a piece of legislation passed in 1970 called the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or IRCO, combined with severe new mandatory minimum sentences for narcotics.
Okay, so the legal landscape changed.
Radically. Before this, if a mobster got caught running a gambling ring or stealing a truck, he might do 3 to 5 years in a relatively comfortable prison. He kept his mouth shut, did his time, and came back to a hero's welcome.
But the new drug laws changed the math entirely. If a mobster was caught dealing heroin, he wasn't looking at 5 years. He was looking at 50 years in a supermax facility.
So the incentive structure of omerta completely breaks down.
Precisely. Paul Castellano knew that if his soldiers were facing life in prison for drugs, the sheer terror of dying in a cage would break their loyalty.
They would flip, become government informants, and trade information about the boss to save themselves. Dealing drugs was a death penalty offense within the family because a drug dealer was a guaranteed future rat.
And the FBI knew all about Gotti's crew dealing heroin because they had tapped Angelo Ruggiero's home phone.
Ruggiero, who was notoriously nicknamed Quack Quack because he quite literally never stopped talking, would visit Paul's mansion for high-level meetings.
Then he would immediately drive back to Queens, pick up his phone, and brag to his crew about every single secret they had just discussed. He served the FBI the inner workings of the Gambino family on a silver platter.
When Paul Castellano finds out about the government's audio tapes, he is furious. Not just about the drugs, but he is terrified that he personally might be implicated on these recordings.
He demands that the leader of the blue-collar faction, his underboss, Neil Della Croce, get copies of the legal discovery tapes from Ruggiero's defense lawyers and bring them directly to the White House so Paul can hear exactly what was said.
But Ruggiero violently stalls. He knows the math. He knows that the second Big Paul hears those tapes and unequivocally confirms they were dealing heroin, it's an automatic death sentence for him, for Gene Gotti, and likely for John Gotti as well, because Gotti was their captain.
So Ruggiero refuses to hand the tapes over, and Della Croce, the underboss, is caught in the middle.
Della Croce is this terrifying old-school enforcer. The guy had eyes so pale and dead they looked almost invisible, but he was deeply loyal to the structure of the family.
He tries to keep the peace, he protects Gotti's crew, acts as a buffer, and repeatedly stalls Paul with excuses.
It becomes a massive, highly visible test of Paul's leadership. The heads of the other 4 New York crime families are watching this play out.
In the mafia, if a boss gives a direct order and his underlings refuse, and the boss does nothing, he is viewed as fatally weak.
But Paul hesitates. As we noted earlier, he preferred corporate negotiation to street warfare when it concerned his own inner circle, perhaps fearing the intense law enforcement heat a shooting war would bring.
And while Paul is hesitating, paralyzed by his own corporate mindset, the FBI drops the hammer. Based entirely on the microphone hidden behind the TV in the kitchen, Paul gets arrested in March 1984 on 51 counts of racketeering.
Then, just a year later in 1985, he gets arrested again in the massive commission case, where the government uses RICO to indict the heads of all 5 New York families simultaneously.
There is a highly telling detail from the day Paul was arrested in the commission case. A reporter noted shaking Paul's hand outside the courthouse and finding it incredibly sweaty and clammy.
This towering godfather, this untouchable CEO, was a nervous wreck.
And in the paranoid echo chamber of the underworld, rumors immediately started swirling that to save himself from dying in prison, Paul might actually cooperate with the government.
The street guys whispered that the CEO might become a rat.
Which is the ultimate catalyst for a coup. John Gotti wants to hit Paul immediately, arguing the family is better off without a weak, greedy boss who might flip.
But Della Croce, the loyal underboss, flat out refuses to sanction a hit on the boss. He tells Gotti, "As long as I am alive, you do not touch him." He physically holds Gotti's ambition in check.
But then, on December 2nd, 1985, Neil Della Croce dies of brain cancer. The dam officially breaks.
With Della Croce gone, the only buffer between Paul Castellano's corporate isolation and John Gotti's violent ambition is removed.
And in the days immediately following Della Croce's death, Paul makes a series of cascading, fatal cultural errors. First, he announces he is permanently breaking up Gotti's crew as punishment for the heroin tapes.
Which backs a cornered animal further into a corner.
And then he commits the unforgivable sin. Knowing the FBI is heavily surveilling the funeral home, Paul decides that attending Della Croce's wake would be bad for business.
He skips the wake of his highly respected, fiercely loyal underboss, a man who dedicated his entire life to protecting the family.
In corporate America, skipping a retirement party is a mild faux pas. In the mafia, skipping the wake of an elder statesman is a profound public insult.
It violated the deepest, most sacred cultural codes of respect. It telegraphed to every single street soldier that Paul cared more about his own legal PR than he did about their brotherhood.
That was the absolute last straw for Gotti.
Gotti realizes it's kill or be killed. He immediately sets his plot in motion. He secretly flips one of Paul's key allies, a capo named Frank DeSico, promising him the underboss role in the new regime.
DeSico is the bait. He convinces Paul to attend a dinner at Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, ostensibly to make peace, discuss family business, and belatedly pay his respects to Della Croce's son.
Which brings us right back to the image we started with. Just picture the symbolism of this hit for a second.
You're standing in Midtown Manhattan. It's not a dark alley in Brooklyn at 3 a.m. It is rush hour in the most densely populated city in America.
When those 4 gunmen executed Paul and his bodyguard, they were just committing a murder. It was an intentional, highly theatrical public execution.
It was a violent slap in the face to everything Paul Castellano stood for. By doing it so openly, John Gotti wasn't just taking over the family. He was declaring the era of the boardroom mobster totally irrevocably dead.
And just days after that spectacular hit, The FBI is watching the Ravenite Social Club down in Little Italy, and they see a literal line of seasoned mobsters waiting in the cold to walk inside and kiss the cheek of the new boss.
John Joseph Gotti Jr. The contrast between him and the previous bosses could not be sharper.
It was a violent regression to the mean. Carlo Gambino valued utter invisibility. Juan Castellano valued corporate respectability. John Gotti valued pure, unadulterated fame.
Gotti was born in 1940, raised in the South Bronx, one of 13 children in a dirt-poor, highly dysfunctional family.
He learned very early on that violence, intimidation, and being the loudest guy in the room were the only currencies that mattered on the street.
He was a street brawler, not a CEO. He dropped out of high school where he was known for taking his classmates' lunch money that he won acting as a teenage bookie.
He gets taken in by a local Gambino capo, Carmine Fedico, and he learns the culture from the absolute gutter up.
He got his signature bouncy walk because a cement mixer crushed his foot when he was trying to steal it at age 14. He spoke almost entirely in aggressive profanity.
He was entirely a creature of the streets. And as he rose through the ranks, doing hard time in prison, handling brutal hits for the family, eventually acting as a capo, he developed this massive, fragile ego.
When he finally orchestrated the hit on Paul and seized the throne at age 45, he didn't view it as taking on a massive responsibility. He viewed it as his royal coronation.
He immediately trades Paul's subtle corporate approach for pure flash. He's wearing $2,000 custom Brioni suits, hand-painted floral silk ties, diamond pinky rings.
He gets his hair perfectly coiffed every single day. He holds court openly, standing on the sidewalk outside the Ravenite Club in Manhattan, waving to tourists.
He basically says to the FBI and the public, "I'm not hiding in a mansion like that, old boss. I am right here."
And for a brief moment, the rank-and-file soldiers actually loved it. Morale shot up. They felt like they were led by a real wise guy again, someone who had bled in the streets and done time just like them.
The rackets were pulling in $500 million a year. But Gotti's psychology was fundamentally flawed. He was a textbook narcissist who dangerously conflated public notoriety with actual sustainable power.
His temper was legendary, and his lack of impulse control was a huge liability. For instance, he was a degenerate gambler.
The FBI transcripts from a bug planted in his club tell a pathetic story. Gotti is sitting there alone on a Sunday night, calling in to get the baseball scores. He loses every single bet he placed.
He blows $20,000 in one night, plus the exorbitant interest to the bookies. And sitting completely alone in an empty room, he just explodes, screaming homophobic slurs at God, throwing a violent tantrum.
It's the emotional regulation of a toddler.
There's another anecdote where an underling accidentally brings him a silver leisure suit instead of a gray one from the dry cleaner, and Gotti genuinely threatens to murder the man right there in the club over the color of a jacket.
Think about what that does to an organization. When narcissistic leadership surrounds itself with terrified sycophants, it completely destroys the feedback loops necessary for survival.
No one dares to tell him he's making a mistake because telling him the truth might get you killed.
That dynamic fed his absolute delusion that he was untouchable, and the media absolutely fed into that delusion.
Yeah.
This is the era of the Teflon Don.
Gotti goes on trial multiple times for racketeering, assault, and conspiracy, and he keeps winning acquittals. The press paints him as an evil genius outsmarting the bumbling government.
But I want to push back hard on this myth of Gotti as some sort of legal mastermind. He wasn't outsmarting the federal prosecutors in the courtroom with brilliant legal strategy. He was just utilizing brute force outside the courtroom.
In an assault case where he brutally beat up a refrigerator repairman over a minor traffic dispute, the victim miraculously gets a case of total amnesia on the witness stand after reading in the newspaper that his attacker is the boss of the Gambino family.
Exactly. The Teflon was forged through witness intimidation and blatant jury tampering. They literally bought off a juror in one of his major federal trials.
But Gotti strutted out of those courthouses, smirking at the cameras, soaking up the applause of his supporters. He told an associate that he didn't seek out the media, they sought him out. But he clearly reveled in the celebrity.
He was completely detached from reality. There was a story where he's sitting in a high-end restaurant with his underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano.
He sees a young, legitimate couple staring at him from across the room. The guy nervously comes over and says, "Mr. Gotti, I think you're great." And Gotti turns to Sammy with this massive grin and says, "See? Everybody loves us."
It's an astonishing level of cognitive dissonance. He truly believed the public adored him. But while he is playing the lovable, well-dressed rogue for the cameras, the reality of his reign was incredibly brutal.
We have to look at the John Favara incident to understand the true sociopathic nature of the power he wielded.
This is one of the most chilling stories in the whole transcript, and it strips away all the glamorous myth-making.
In 1980, before Gotti was even the boss, his 12-year-old son Frankie is riding a motorized mini bike in their neighborhood in Howard Beach, Queens. He darts out blindly from behind a dumpster and is hit and killed by a car driven by their backyard neighbor, a working-class guy named John Favara.
The police investigate thoroughly and rule it a tragic, unavoidable accident. No charges are filed.
It was a horrific tragedy that destroyed 2 families, but Favara was reportedly warned by locals not to go over to the Gotti house to apologize, that tensions were too high, and Gotti's wife, Victoria, was inconsolable.
Favara receives death threats, so he frantically makes plans to sell his house and move his family away.
But he wasn't quick enough. Just 2 days before he was scheduled to move, 3 men grab Favara outside his workplace, pistol whip him, throw him into a van, and he is never seen again.
He's vanished without a trace. And conveniently, John and his wife Victoria were vacationing in Florida when it happened, giving them a perfect alibi.
It is pure, unforgiving brutality. This wasn't Robin Hood fighting the system. This was a violent syndicate willing to murder a neighbor over an accident.
But by constantly smirking at the cameras, by actively humiliating the prosecutors on the evening news, and putting his face on the cover of Time magazine with a sneer, Gotti guaranteed one thing.
He focused the entire unrelenting weight and unlimited budget of federal law enforcement directly onto his family. He made it their singular institutional mission to crush him.
Which brings us to the final act, the ultimate betrayal and the rapid collapse of the empire. By 1990, the FBI has had enough of the public humiliation.
They know Gotti operates heavily out of the Ravenite Club. Through a stroke of luck and intense surveillance, they discover that Gotti frequently holds his most sensitive conversations not in the club itself, but in a small, private apartment 2 floors above the club, owned by an elderly widow.
Gotti thought this apartment was a safe haven. He thought he was being a fox.
But the FBI manages to slip in and plant a high-tech microphone directly into the apartment circuitry. And what they capture on those tapes over the next several months exposes the fatal flaw of Gotti's leadership: his profound disloyalty to his own men.
He is caught on tape running his mouth for hours, and specifically, he is caught bad-mouthing his own underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano.
Sammy was a tough, highly capable, intensely loyal guy who handled the family's incredibly lucrative construction rackets. He had been by Gotti's side for years and had helped coordinate the Castellano hit.
But Gotti, in his arrogance, is complaining on tape about Sammy's greed, basically throwing his loyal underboss under the bus to justify his own massive financial demands. He blames Sammy for murders they planned together.
On December 11, 1990, the FBI raids the Ravenite Club. They arrest Gotti, Gravano, and the family consigliere, Frank Lucascio. Gotti is facing a massive slew of RICO charges, including ordering the murder of Paul Castellano.
Because of his history of witness tampering, both Gotti and Gravano are denied bail. And as they sit in separate cells in federal prison, the government plays the tapes for them. The reality of what Gotti said sets in.
Sammy listens to the tapes and realizes that Gotti is actively setting him up to take the fall for everything.
The government prosecutors sit down with Sammy and make the math perfectly clear. They have enough audio evidence to implicate him in 19 separate murders. He is never going home. Unless, of course, he cooperates.
And here is the profound irony of the entire story. John Gotti spent his entire life preaching about the sacred honor of the streets. He ranted on tape endlessly about how much he hated rats and informants.
Yet, his own narcissism, his uncontrollable mouth, and his willingness to betray his closest ally created the single most devastating rat in mafia history.
Facing life in a concrete box, while the boss who betrayed him tried to beat the rap, Sammy the Bull makes a calculated decision. He breaks the ancient code of omerta.
He agrees to testify against John Gotti in exchange for a lighter sentence of 5 years. When Sammy took the witness stand at the trial, the look of pure, venomous hatred between the 2 men was palpable.
Gravano methodically laid out exactly how Gotti ran the family, the mechanics of the extortion rackets, and exactly how they plotted the Castellano assassination.
It was impenetrable testimony. The jury took less than 2 days to convict Gotti on all counts.
And even at the absolute end, his ego wouldn't let him face reality. He gets sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole.
The judge also tacks on a mandatory $50 special assessment fee for the court costs.
And in the holding cell, while taking off his designer tie for the last time, Gotti just laughs and says to a guard, "Boy, that $50 fee, they really know how to stick it to a guy, huh?" He is locked away forever in a cage, and he's treating it like a PR joke.
And his delusion only deepened in prison. He was sent to the maximum security penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, where he was locked in a cell 23 hours a day.
There's an incredible anecdote where, right before Gravano officially flipped, Gotti seriously suggested to Sammy that they could gather $1 million from the street crews and bribe a president to get a presidential pardon so they could walk out the front door.
He truly, genuinely believed his mob money and street influence could corrupt the very top of the American executive branch.
It's sheer insanity. But the damage he did to the Gambino family didn't stop when the cell door slammed shut. From his prison cell, Gotti issues an order that his son, John Gotti Jr., is to take over as the acting boss of the family.
And this is the ultimate blinding hypocrisy. Think about it. Why did Gotti murder Paul Castellano in the first place?
His entire justification was that Paul hadn't earned his spot on the street, that Paul only got the job through nepotism because he was Carlo's cousin.
What does Gotti do? He appoints his relatively inexperienced 28-year-old son to run a massive criminal empire, completely bypassing hundreds of hardened, experienced capos who felt they had bled for the right to lead.
He destroyed whatever meritocracy was left in the organization. He became the exact thing he despised, and John Jr. was completely unequipped to lead.
He had his father's famous last name, but he possessed none of his father's cunning or street instincts. The older, seasoned guys secretly despised him, calling him dumb boy behind his back.
But nobody wanted to officially challenge him for the throne because being the boss now just meant painting a giant red target on your back for the FBI. Why take the job when it guarantees you'll be indicted under RICO and spend the rest of your life in Supermax?
So the family just rapidly decays from the inside out.
You look at the arc. You go from Carlo Gambino controlling international shipping cartels, holding the garment industry hostage, and wielding immense political power, to John Jr. and his crew of steroid-infused weightlifters shaking down local discos in Westchester for pocket change.
It gets so absurd that in the late 90s, the Gambino family was actually making money running 900-number astrology and phone sex hotlines.
It is a pathetic, precipitous fall from grace.
The older generation that built the wealth was swept away too. Carlo's son, Tommy Gambino, who had quietly and successfully run the garment district rackets for decades under his father's old model of invisibility, was finally busted on antitrust charges.
He was sent to federal prison in the mid-90s, and he had to pay a $12 million fine just to avoid a longer sentence. The entire structural infrastructure, the unions, the political bribes, the construction cartels built by Carlo and exploited by Paul, was systematically dismantled by the government.
Which brings us to why we spent an hour unpacking all of this. Why does this matter to you?
Because this isn't just an entertaining true crime story. It is the ultimate cautionary tale about the life cycle of an organization and the rot of unchecked ego.
When an organizational culture shifts from quiet, disciplined competence, like Carlo Gambino, who made himself invisible, suppressed his ego, and valued survival over credit, to the corporate greed and arrogant isolation of Paul Castellano, the foundation begins to crack.
But when that culture finally shifts to pure narcissism, personal branding, and a desperate obsession with media clout under John Gotti, total collapse isn't just possible, it is inevitable.
The organization entirely forgot its core operating principles. Carlo inherently understood that real power doesn't need to announce itself. It operates in the shadows.
Gotti fundamentally misunderstood power. He thought the loud announcement was the power. And in the end, that fundamental misunderstanding of mechanics versus PR destroyed a multi-billion-dollar empire that had taken a century to build.
We've seen the entire trajectory today, from an invisible, highly disciplined shadow government operating through nods and whispers to a flashy, self-immolating reality show disaster playing out on the evening news.
But I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. Something that bridges this dark history to the highly connected world we live in right now.
What's that?
Carlo Gambino's greatest weapon was utter secrecy. He was so terrified of being overheard by the government that he wouldn't even speak aloud in his own home. He communicated murders with a silent nod.
Right.
In today's world of ubiquitous digital footprints, facial recognition, GPS tracking, encrypted messaging that eventually gets cracked, and a corporate culture completely obsessed with social media clout, is a shadow empire of the Gambino's physical scale even possible anymore?
That's a great question.
Or have the shrewdest foxes, the ones who truly understand how to quietly manipulate systems for massive profit without leaving a trace, simply moved out of the violent criminal underworld entirely and embedded themselves deep into the legal algorithmic structures of modern tech and global finance?
The physical tactics of extortion evolve, but the ambition to control the system remains exactly the same.
Something to think about the next time you look at the leadership structures, the egos, and the invisible choke points in your own world. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.